And I took a job as the director of Market Street Restoration Agency in 1990, and I stayed in that organization for 12 years. And I learned many things, and I enjoyed working with lots of merchants and business leaders and so on and so forth. But it was during this time that I got a phone call. Get smart in case of those of you who remember him. I got a phone call that said, hey, we discussed with you that Pritchard House project a year ago or so. Now we're thinking about tearing down some other buildings. And we just thought we'd float it past you because we know what happened last time, right? Because it was a big deal in the community. And so in my head I'm thinking, now this, for anybody who knows anything about this sort of thing, Pruitt-Igoe was where they tore down a bunch of buildings that weren't working. It was a failure. This is a prime example of a failure. This was a housing that didn't work. So they ended up tearing it down. So I was thinking about that, but then I was also thinking of, oh yeah, the Pritchard House. Weighing out my options. Thinking, what shall I do? So I said, well, we're going to tear down these buildings. They're between Denison Parkway and First Street. There are a whole bunch of old buildings that don't really look like much. They don't look very special. In fact, they're pretty woebegone and so on and so forth. So I thought, okay, tear them down, not tear them down. And time was fleeting. They didn't give me much time to give them an answer. In fact, for some reason, I felt compelled that I had to give them an instant answer. Something that my mother has always reminded me from that day forward, that time is on your side. You don't owe anyone an answer immediately if you need to think about it. So I was very busy with a bunch of things, as we all are every day. And I thought, those buildings aren't really very special. I've got a lot of other things that are brewing I need to deal with, right? I didn't ask enough questions. I did not utilize the resources of people who may know more. I did not give myself enough time to explore the options. I thought I needed an instant answer. I did not use my intuition. And I didn't question why they might be asking me this for my permission. I mean, after all, why is my permission that important? And I did not undertake any research. So I'd been pressed for time. I didn't think the historic resources were significant. I said that I didn't see any reason that they shouldn't be demolished, and I wanted to choose my battles. That was important in my job. I couldn't say everything should be preserved. They didn't look significant, and I had other pressing issues. So that was my big mistake. Several months later, someone called me and asked if I knew who was believed to have lived in one of those houses that was demolished. And I said, no, who? Anybody recognize her? Margaret Sanger, who's a very important person, and I was really sorry to hear that our director of Planned Parenthood isn't here today. He was another speaker. Margaret Sanger, I was told, may have lived in one of those houses. My heart sank. I fell to the floor. I wanted to die. What had I done? I let everybody down. So what I learned is that making assumptions about the importance of something was a bad idea. Making assumptions, you know what they say about that? Making assumptions, what that means. Just because something looks unimportant does not make it so. Someone wanted my approval for something, but I didn't question why they might want it. I wonder why they were asking, and I should have taken a closer look. I should have really wondered, why were they asking for my permission? Maybe they wanted it on someone else's shoulders? And I did not owe them an immediate answer. So these are things that I have thought about many times since that day. And I do have the right to say, I'll think about it and get back to you. And that's probably the biggest lesson that I learned, and that I tell my children a lot, and to take time and gather information. I also thought that since I had lost a previous battle, the same entity wouldn't come back to me with another losing proposition. How would they think of doing that, right? But all's fair in love, war, and historic preservation battles. And in the end, I assumed that they knew the significance of the house, and my error put the responsibility squarely on my shoulders. Perhaps they were trying to be good citizens, and my mistake was just that, my mistake. Maybe theirs too. I thought I was choosing my battles, and if so, I should have researched to know that this was a battle worth choosing. Now, the reason I call my talk the failure that keeps on giving, or the gift that keeps on giving, I thought because the foundation and gifts and all that was tied together, but it's also a silver lining. Just like the flood of 1972 was a silver lining for our community, because we were prepared to start and revitalize our downtown, and the flood, even though it was a horrible thing, enabled us to do some things. I look at this as a gift for me to realize that I need to learn from my mistakes. And due to my hasty error, now this is chapter 2. So over these 24 years I've thought about this, I have spent years feeling I had let my community and Margaret Sanger down, and we had lost an important historic resource. But was it really true that Margaret Sanger lived there in one of these houses? I don't know. I had not sought documentation to find out whether this was true. I just thought about it a lot, right? I don't want to make the same mistake twice. I don't want to assume. I need to find the answers. So this presentation gave me the kick in the pants to say, I need to research that and finally come to closure on this, not only for my own personal psyche, but also to be able to move on with this in our community. Because, by the way, nobody ever talks about the fact that Margaret Sanger was from Corning, New York. So, despite this error, I did not find a way to honor Margaret Sanger's historic legacy over the last 24 years. I have done nothing except think about it. And so, looking for the alternatives to improve upon the error was a way to move in a positive direction. So I'm going to close this by saying I have started chapter 3. And I have been researching our local history, our local library, and resources around have no city directories for the time period in which Margaret Sanger was born, 1879 to 1890. After that point, we know where she lived in some of the houses. We have an idea, right? But fortunately, due to a new resource being online, I was able to find something this past week, and that is that in 1880, in June of 1880, when Margaret Sanger was 8 months old, she lived at 55 Market Street. Now you can see the first box is her father, Michael Higgins. The second box down there, the 55 stands for the address on Market Street, which you can't see. Market Street's written along the side. The number after that is the number and sequence of which they, in which they surveyed the people living there during the census. And then the last one there is Margaret Higgins. That's her, the daughter. And I don't know if you can read it, but 8/12, right in the middle there, in the middle of her name, that was her age. So my next chapter is I'm going to figure out where 55 Market Street was, because the numbering system did change. I'm trying to figure it out. But the other part of this is I went back and found the addresses and people at the Historical Society and a couple people in the community, the Dimitroffs, directed me to a couple things, and I found out some of the addresses. But none of the addresses that we know anything about were anywhere near that site. But we don't really know for sure. So I'm going to keep on that mistake that I made and see what's next. And finally, I wanted to point out that the two addresses that we do have that she lived in, 238 West 2nd Street, which I didn't know until yesterday, is a lovely house. And she lived there in 1893. And the other thing that happened is in 1899, she came back to, so how old was she? She was 19 years old. She came back to Corning to be with her mother, who died at a very early age of 48. And she stayed there for a year. She was a teacher. And she lived in this little white house here, which has some remnants of its historic nature, but it's been covered over and So we'll see what happens there. However, I do know that she was a teacher, and it's kitty corner from the alternative school, so I don't know if that was built at that point or not, and I have to research that. But anyway, that's what I wanted to say, is it's inspired me to find some answers and try to move on with the mistake that I made and learn from it. And I hope that I have given you something to think about today. So thank you very much. Any questions? Enter.
So one of the addresses was on Erie, but it wasn't, because Erie is what is now Denison, right?
Yes.
But it wasn't that same area?
So there was an area called Irish Hill, and there was an area around where Wegmans is today that I believe from the descriptions that I read, she may have lived for some time in that neighborhood where Wegmans currently is. And that's also what Sherry from the Historical Society said, that she thought that that was the neighborhood that she spent some time in. But just directly above that was this neighborhood of West 2nd Street. So I think that that was also part of Irish Hill. Maybe somebody here knows, but I'll learn more about that. Any other questions?
So how do you choose your priorities? Like if she had in fact lived in that little house, but now you find out she also lived in all these other little houses. How do you choose your battle?
So as a historic preservationist, one thing I would do is in a community where you have, when you have buildings that you're trying to preserve, they're often preserved because of their architectural nature, but another reason they're preserved is because of the person or people that are affiliated with them, or other things like the industry and the community, et cetera, et cetera. So in this case, I should have found out, did she in fact live there, and if so, what part of the 14 years that she lived in Corning, actually 16 in the end, 16 years that she lived in Corning, would she have lived there? And A, was it a building that could have been salvaged? B, if we had made it known, would there have been an upsurge of people interested in it? But if I had also found out that we knew the addresses of where she lived and that wasn't it, I could have put it off and said, okay, I know the answer to this and I'm good, I'm going to move on to my next priority, right? So sometimes it's a little hard and subjective, because if we do have other addresses, now the addresses that we have were not, I would say that the White House was more significant than the cute little house that you saw there, only because she lived there for a year and she was a teacher and she was established as an adult. But I think that the place that she was born, which we know is 55 Market Street, is probably the most important thing for us to go back and think about, well, how do we honor that? But then I probably would have gone to the Planned Parenthood and said, you know, what do you want to do around this? Is there something that you would like to do? And try to find out if there was support in the community. So I guess that would have been part of the process. Any other questions? Yes?
You may have mentioned this, but what group was doing the demolishing?
I don't really want to mention it because I don't want to, yeah. No, I mean, it's a fair question. It's just that, yeah, I prefer not answering it. But totally a fair question, and I'm sorry not to say who it was. Yes?
So on the issue of houses that have housed famous people, I mean, if you had researched that house, her name would not have come up because she didn't live there. You know, so do you have to go through census records and look for, you know, like there's a lot of people that came from this area. So, do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you go about determining, you didn't hear that till after the fact.
Yeah.
So if it's a new project, a new thing, and it's a house, how do you go about determining, okay, Carter never lived here, so-and-so never, you know, like, is there a checklist of people you must check out? Or?
Yeah, it's kind of like finding the needle in the haystack, isn't it? So usually when we're asked this question, it's about one building, right? So in that case, then we would go and research it, and we go to the Steuben County offices, and we do a deed search.
Okay.
And then we can do census checks to look at the address and see who's there. But it is a bit like finding a needle in a haystack. What I should have done was I should have asked people who had more knowledge about the history, like Tom and P.D. Dimitrov, or people of the Historical Society, Mary Ann Sprague. I should have just gone to them and say, hey, what do you know? Is there any rumor about important people who were living here? But it's a difficult one to grasp sometimes, especially if it's a group of buildings, then it's pretty tough.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.